Hi, folks. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about Ben Shapiro. Now, most of you probably know Ben as a conservative commentator, a man who claims to stand against the woke left, constantly fighting leftists and the progressive ideology that they try to inflict on this country and the world. But at this point, it's become increasingly clear that this isn't actually who Ben Shapiro is. And today, we're going to examine exactly why. The fault lines have been revealing themselves over the last few years. And ironically, one of the biggest fault lines has to do with something Ben himself spent years criticizing the left for. If you go back to around 2017 to about 2020, especially during the lead up to the Democrat presidential primary, one of the things Ben talked about constantly was intersectionality and how it was being weaponized by the left to advance its political ideology. And to be fair, Ben had a point. He was absolutely correct about that. Intersectionality became a political weapon. For anyone who may not be familiar with the term, intersectionality is an analytical framework that argues an individual's overlapping social and political identities, such as race, gender, class, sexuality, and disability, intersect to create unique forms of discrimination, privilege, and systemic oppression. Now, thankfully, this ideology has largely been beaten to death. The right had a very strong reaction against it being injected into politics. And while there are certainly still parts of the left that continue to operate under this intersectional framework, we're now witnessing parts of the right doing something very similar. Ironically enough, Ben Shapiro is one of the people leading the charge on this. He's now pushing identity-based narratives and woke-style political arguments in order to advance his own Israel first political cause. As we all know at this point, Ben has increasingly revealed himself over the last several years as an Israel first political actor. He's on the record saying that he would move to Israel if America ever became or felt unsafe for him. He's constantly advocating for escalating conflict between the United States and Iran on behalf of Israel. It's been a pretty significant reveal, to say the least. Not that it was necessarily a surprise, but I think people were simply much more tolerant of it before October 7th and before the war in Gaza. Ever since then, after watching the conduct of the Israeli government and their military, and after seeing what often has been described as increasingly indiscriminate military actions along with genocidal rhetoric from Israeli leaders, a lot of folks, particularly on the American left and on the right, has started looking at Ben's statements through a very different lens. Now, what's interesting is that this identity-based style of political activism took over the left very quickly, but it's had a much slower creep into the right. Yet, that's exactly what we're beginning to see happen. And all of this brings us to the New York elections we discussed just a few days ago. A number of candidates backed by Mamdani won their elections or primaries, and several candidates supported by Hassan Piker did the same. Naturally, there were a lot of reactions from people on the right. I made a video discussing the election results myself, but there was one specific reaction that primarily came from the Israel First neoconservative wing of the conservative movement, including Ben Shapiro, and it was incredibly revealing. In fact, the New York Post echoed this exact same narrative, which Ben lays out in the following clip. Let's watch it, and we'll discuss this on the other side.
What it is. Who's leading all of this? Who's leading all of this? Who is the DSA? As we pointed out, it is overeducated, useless white people. Some of them are white, some of them are not. But bottom line is, this professional, disproportionately white, the professional useless class, they've been manufactured over the last 20, 30, 40 years in university classrooms. They've been majoring in absolute junk. They're unemployable losers who have never held a real job, but they did go to the best colleges for years and then more years, and then they can't get real jobs. So they end up as community organizers or agitators or political aides for crappy candidates who hate the country. The Democratic Socialists of America is a make-work machine for college-educated losers. That's what it is.
So there you have it, folks. Ben Shapiro is saying that the DSA is made up of overeducated, useless white people. He kind of couches it a bit, saying, oh, there are other races too. But he makes it clear that he's primarily blaming white people for the rise of the DSA. In other words, he's arguing that the rise in prominence of the Democratic Socialists of America, the faction of the Democrat Party backing Mamdani and many of these other candidates, while effectively taking over the Democrat Party from within like a parasite, is squarely the fault of white people. The reason that's important to notice is because it's factually inaccurate. And I would argue this is a purposeful misrepresentation of what actually happened and what the DSA coalition actually looks like. See, it's well documented that Mamdani actually has large swaths of Jewish support, particularly among younger Jewish voters. In January of this year, 2026, Dropsite published an article titled Zohar Mamdani has more Jewish support than you think. They wrote, while attention is on the new mayor's revocation of pro-Israel executive orders, analysis reveals age and income shape the Jewish vote more than ethnicity, religion, and support for Israel. The article then goes into an extensive precinct-by-precinct breakdown of how different neighborhoods voted. And perhaps the most striking data comes from Brooklyn, and I actually lived there for quite a bit. I used to work in Park Slope, which is an extremely progressive neighborhood filled with some of the most left-wing people you'll ever meet. And according to this article, in Park Slope, a progressive professional class neighborhood bordering Prospect Park, Mamdani routinely won precincts with a preponderance of Jewish surnames by more than 77% of the vote. In Brooklyn Heights, one of the city's wealthiest zip codes, with multi-million-dollar views of the Manhattan skyline, Mamdani's support was lower but still routinely exceeded 65%. Lower Manhattan was more divided, with Cuomo dominating wealthier areas like Tribeca and Flatiron, while Mamdani carried portions of Greenwich Village and Chelsea. Later in the piece, Dropsite concludes that while Cuomo performed better among older and wealthier Jewish voters, Mamdani performed best among younger Jewish voters and those with lower incomes. So needless to say, while obviously not all Jewish voters supported Mamdani and the DSA, and certainly not the more pro-Israel factions of the Jewish community, it's well documented that Mamdani and the DSA have substantial Jewish support. So why then would Ben selectively blame white people, this useless class of white people, as he calls them, for the rise of the DSA? Now, what's even more interesting is that this exact narrative was echoed by the New York Post, which ran a front page featuring what appeared to be 3 white women alongside several other supporters with a headline about the young and clueless, and claiming that just 7% of voters, mostly white and under 30, pick Israel-hating radicals to represent Democrats. But again, why are we singling out white people? We all know the coalition supporting these candidates is far more diverse than that. It includes large numbers of non-white voters and, as we've just discussed, significant numbers of Jewish voters as well. The people on that cover may look white, but are they Jewish? I don't know. Ben Shapiro himself, during that Jubilee debate with Naima, explicitly argued that he doesn't consider himself white, that his Jewish ethnicity distinguishes him from whiteness. So how do we know these folks are actually white by Ben's own standard? And is that exactly why Ben chooses to separate himself from the pigment of his own skin while directing criticism at white people? Because when Ben uses the term white in this context, he's really talking about Europeans, particularly people of white European Christian descent. He's not criticizing Jews, he's not documenting Jewish support for Mamdani, and he certainly isn't criticizing the broader intersectional coalition that has driven the modern Democrat Party for years. He's not talking about the activist wing built around the intersectional pyramid like the BLM activists, the progressive black activists, or even the Southeast Asian activists who are just as committed to woke intersectional ideology. Just like Nithya Raman here in Los Angeles. She's essentially a mirror image of Mamdani and his coalition in New York. That's also part of the DSA coalition, in fact, a large swath. So why is Ben, knowing all of this, choosing to single out white people? Well, the answer, in my view, is because he knows exactly what he's doing. He wants to aggregate Jews into the broader category of white without ever specifically criticizing the Jewish voters who are helping elect these radical DSA candidates. That allows him to castigate white people exclusively as a bloc for ushering in socialism while conveniently avoiding discussion of the other demographic groups making up the coalition. But the reality is, as the Dropsite analysis demonstrated, this coalition, this DSA coalition, cuts across multiple demographic groups and is driven primarily by age and income, not race. The fact that Ben injects race into the conversation at all is the most revealing part. This is the same man, by the way, who spent years railing against intersectionality and identity politics. Now he's relying on those exact same identity-based narratives to explain the failures of the coalition that he and other Israel-first neocons fractured. He chose identity over coalition politics. To be fair, It wasn't just Ben. He helped popularize a narrative that spread throughout much of the Republican Party, one centered on unconditional support for Israel and Israel's conflicts, regardless of the consequences for the broader conservative movement, which so far are looking just like total loss. Anyway, it doesn't stop there. Since we're already on the topic of Israel, Ben and the Israel First neocon wing have been in an absolute hissy fit over J.D. Vance criticizing the Israeli government and pushing for the signing of the MOU peace agreement with Iran. That immediately made Vance a target for these neocons. During the negotiations at the G7 this past week, Vance briefly met with Pakistani officials and was caught in a short video clip saying that he loves Pakistan. And that was enough for these Israel First neocons to completely lose their minds, with many of them immediately insinuating questions of dual loyalty and asking how the vice president of the United States could possibly say he loves Pakistan. Anyway, here's Ben's reaction to that clip.
Here he was talking about how awesome Pakistan, they're just the best. They're a Chinese cutout gang. Pakistan is in the negotiations because the Chinese wanted them there. They're an Islamist dictatorship. This is ridiculous.
About the Pakistani role, especially.
Very good. We love Pakistan. Thank you.
We love Pakistan. Okay, he says as he walks through them. We love Pakistan. Do we? Do we love Pakistan? Like here he was praising the Pakistanis.
To his Field Marshal in Pakistan, Asim Munir, I will say that since Field Marshal Munir welcomed us with the Prime Minister in Islamabad, I have joked that I have two very, very important people in my life, an Indian and a Pakistani. The Indian is my wife, and the Pakistani is Field Marshal Munir. And I've probably talked to Field Marshal Munir more than I've talked to anybody else over the last 3 months.
That's magical. Isn't that nice? Isn't that wonderful? No, it's weak and ridiculous. That Field Marshal has literally called for the destruction of the state of Israel, which is our ally in this war, unless you forgot.
And there you have it, folks. Honestly, Ben just made a better case for my argument than I could ever make myself. You saw it. You saw the criticism, the quality of the criticism, the bitterness, the pettiness. It all traces back to one thing: a public official daring to criticize Israel. That's what this is really about. And what's so ridiculous is that even taking Ben's argument at face value, you're left asking a very simple question. What exactly is America supposed to do here? What do you want J.D. Vance to do? Are we supposed to alienate every country everywhere because of Israel? Are we supposed to risk going to war with everyone because this rogue state keeps creating new enemies throughout its own actions? Is America's foreign policy really supposed to revolve around following Israel into every conflict, about supporting Israel unconditionally? Because that's effectively what Ben is arguing. Israel continues bombing countries throughout the region, tensions continue escalating, and somehow the expectation is that the United States should simply absorb the consequences every single time. Really? Is that where we're at now? Because that is just genuinely absurd. What's even more revealing is how these Israel First commentators, like Ben, have exposed their own bloodlust throughout this entire war, these conflicts over the last few years. Just think about it. How often do you actually hear them praising the Trump administration, J.D. Vance, or even President Trump himself? In fact, many of them became openly critical of Trump the moment Trump started pursuing a peace agreement with Iran, the moment the MOU was being negotiated. They were like, release the MOU, release the MOU. Let us be critical of it and destroy it before it even is signed. These are the folks who turned on J.D. Vance for seeking diplomacy. They criticized Trump for trying to de-escalate a war. And then almost overnight, they turned around once again. Why? Well, you're never going to believe it. Because Trump bombed Iran again after Iran attacked one of our cargo ships. Suddenly, they're right back on board. And that tells you everything about what their true priorities are.
This is part of a shift that is happening away from the interpretation of this not very good MOU in sort of J.D. Vance fashion and toward a much more Marco Rubio-like foreign policy. The idea is that we're not going to keep overlooking Iranian violence, particularly in the Strait of Hormuz. That's great. It's excellent. And the reason it's excellent is because you need the credible threat of use of force in order to get the Iranians to even abide by basic terms of agreements. And when you add what just happened in the Strait of Hormuz to the move that was made by Secretary of State Rubio at the behest of President Trump in this deal between Israel and Lebanon, you're starting to see the beginning of a good foreign policy emerge once again in the Middle East. Today, says Secretary Rubio, the governments of Israel and Lebanon made a bold decision to agree to a framework that builds a realistic path out of endless conflict. This agreement establishes a clear and structured process to restore Lebanon's sovereignty, disarm Hezbollah and dismantle its terrorist infrastructure and enable Israel to return to its borders once that threat to its citizens is removed. Now, again, this is great because what this means is two solid moves in favor of a Middle East that is not built around Iranian power. It is built around limiting and destroying Iran's forward terrorist capacity. So those are two huge moves that just happened.
I don't think I've seen Ben with a smile that big on his face since the war with Iran first began. The man genuinely seems to enjoy seeing blood running in the streets, and it's honestly disturbing to watch. Anyway, what Ben is referencing here is this new framework agreement signed between Israel and the Lebanese government. Now, there is already a tremendous amount of skepticism surrounding this deal. Almost immediately after it was signed, protests erupted in Beirut, particularly from Hezbollah supporters who denounced it as a surrender of Lebanese sovereignty and accused the government of capitulating to Israeli and American demands. Under the agreement, the Lebanese armed forces would gradually assume control of southern Lebanon as Hezbollah is disarmed, while Israel would conduct a phased withdrawal from portions of Lebanese territory. However, Israel is still permitted to maintain an expanded security zone inside southern Lebanon, and the timeline for its withdrawal isn't really fixed. Instead, it's tied to Hezbollah's disarmament, which is one of the primary reasons critics argue the agreement overwhelmingly favors Israel. It could stay there permanently, arguing that Hezbollah has never been dismantled. Now, there are also serious legal concerns surrounding the deal. One provision requires both Israel and Lebanon to cease hostile actions against one another in international political and legal forums. Legal experts in Lebanon have warned that this language could effectively block Lebanese victims of Israeli war crimes from pursuing justice through international courts and could eliminate any future effort to grant the International Criminal Court jurisdiction inside Lebanon. In other words, the agreement doesn't just seek to end the fighting, it could also shut the door on future accountability for war crimes committed by Israel during this conflict. And for anybody who's been following along, there are a lot of them. And what's perhaps most telling is what happened immediately after this agreement was signed. See, less than 24 hours after the agreement was signed, Israeli forces were already conducting new drone strikes in southern Lebanon. Lebanon's health ministry reported at least one person killed and several others wounded, while Israeli officials said the strike targeted an individual they claimed posed a threat. So before the ink on the agreement really had an opportunity to dry, military operations had already resumed in southern Lebanon. Needless to say, this agreement has divided Lebanon almost immediately. Supporters argue it's a necessary step toward reducing Hezbollah's influence and restoring Lebanese sovereignty. Opponents see it as a humiliating concession that rewards Israeli military action while demanding unilateral concessions from Lebanon. And the fact that Israel resumed strikes almost immediately has only reinforced skepticism that this agreement will produce any sort of lasting, meaningful peace. What's also truly interesting is the timing of this Lebanese-Israeli agreement, because it came on the heels of yet another UN report accusing Israel of deliberately targeting children in Gaza while repeating its conclusion from last year that Israel has committed genocide in that region. This latest report, published by the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry, alleges that roughly 30% of the Palestinians killed between October 2023 and October 2025 were children, more than 20,000 children in total. The commission claims there is evidence that some children were intentionally targeted by sniper fire and quadcopter drones, citing doctors who examined victims and concluded that many of the gunshot wounds appeared to be precise rather than incidental. The report also alleges that children have continued to be killed even after the October 2025 ceasefire, and argues that Israel has continued to disregard both the ceasefire and its obligations under international law. Now, none of this came out of nowhere. This is essentially a continuation of the Commission's findings from last September, when it concluded that Israel had committed genocide in Gaza. At the time, the Commission argued that Israeli political and military leaders had demonstrated genocidal intent through both their public statements and the conduct of the war itself. It accused Israel of carrying out 4 of the 5 acts prohibited under the Genocide Convention, including killing Palestinians, inflicting serious bodily and mental harm, imposing conditions of life intended to destroy the population, and preventing births. The commission went even further, alleging that Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, had incited genocide while recommending that other countries halt arms transfers to Israel and pursue accountability through international legal mechanisms. Israel, of course, has categorically rejected both reports. Israeli officials have called them politically motivated, unverified, and fundamentally biased, arguing that the commission exists to single out Israel rather than establish the truth. But regardless of where someone falls on those allegations, the timing is undeniably significant. Within days of another major UN report reviving accusations of genocide and the deliberate targeting of children, Israel signs an agreement with Lebanon that critics argue could make future international legal action substantially more difficult by requiring both countries to cease hostile actions against one another in international legal forums. Now, whether that timing is coincidental or intentional, it's certainly noteworthy, and it adds another layer to why this agreement has generated so much controversy almost immediately after it was signed. Now, all that being said, you're never going to believe who, shortly after that report was published a video himself arguing why the United Nations should be abolished. If you said Ben Shapiro, you won absolutely nothing. Congratulations. Hope you're happy.
The best case scenario is that the UN is considered mostly necessary but useless. The worst case scenario is that it's necessary, useless, and dangerous because internationalism chips away at sovereignty and because internationalism is basically a way for the worst people on earth to pretend that they have moral authority. So, let's just knock over the UN building. Build a park. Give it to President Trump to build a tower. Admit what over a century of evidence shows. The UN and the League of Nations before it failed to prevent world war, actual genocide, pandemics, and every other human rights abuse imaginable. They have succeeded in creating an enormous, unaccountable bureaucracy that isn't worth the building it exists within today. Oh yeah, and a bunch of bureaucrats who don't have to pay their parking tickets.
Look, I'm going to lead off by saying this. I have plenty of criticisms of the United Nations. I think it's a largely ineffective organization, a massive bloated bureaucracy that accomplishes very little and is often used to pressure the United States into acting against its own interests. Ironically, it's headquartered here in America. That said, I have called for the abolition of the United Nations myself, because I see that though this organization traces its roots back to ideas promoted by Woodrow Wilson, in my opinion, it's been a failure for decades. And frankly, that's a pretty common opinion, especially on the American right. Now, what I find interesting, though, is the timing of Ben Shapiro choosing to publish a video calling for the dissolution of the United Nations, saying it's run by the worst people in the world, right as the United Nations releases an updated report repeating its accusation that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. Again, one of the central findings of the report is that Israel committed 4 of the 5 prohibited acts under the Genocide Convention, including killing Palestinians, inflicting serious bodily and mental harm, deliberately imposing conditions of life intended to destroy the population, and preventing births. And in fact, as we saw, this latest report also alleged that more than 20,000 children have been killed during this conflict, with investigators arguing that in some cases, children were deliberately targeted by Israeli forces. Again, this is what turned so many people against Israel, so many Americans against Israel. People aren't reacting to this in a vacuum. They're reacting to years of footage showing children maimed, children killed, children being pulled from rubble, and children being shot. Just a couple of weeks ago, a video went viral that appeared to show an IDF soldier shooting a baby. Whether you agree with every legal conclusion reached by the UN or not, the images coming out of Gaza have fundamentally changed public opinion to be against Israel. Gaza now has one of the largest populations of maimed children in the world. And that's before you even get into the famine. Starvation has historically been one of the methods used to carry out mass atrocities and genocidal campaigns. You saw it during the Holodomor under the Soviet Union. You saw it under Mao's rule in China. The use of famine as a weapon isn't some unprecedented concept. People recognize what they're looking at, and that's why public opinion has shifted so dramatically against Israel. Now, to me, it's all there for anyone willing to look. Ben Shapiro has become a shill for foreign interests. I genuinely don't understand how someone can call themselves an American while appearing to care more about advancing the interests of a foreign government than protecting America's own sovereignty. I don't understand why the United States should continually subordinate its own interests to serve another country simply because that country has influence and political power here. This is precisely why so many Americans have grown tired of our relationship with Israel and why there's an increasing push for decoupling. Israel is less popular with the American public today than it has been in decades. They've even lost the boomers. And if you've lost that generation too, you know you're facing a serious long-term political and optical problem. Anyway, folks, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. I hope you have a terrific day. Peace.